Good afternoon, everybody. We will click and let people in as they arrive. If they do arrive with microphones on, hopefully they'll realise and turn them off pretty quickly. So really giddy with excitement this evening. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to tonight's network session. Before we start, I'd like to celebrate the fact that we actually hit over 10,000 members in the Facebook group sometime overnight. Who on earth joins overnight? Our membership, just to put that in perspective, has increased by more than 54% in the last 12 months. And we actually only accept 2/3 in because a third of them are not necessarily SEN professionals and SENCOs. So the fact we've hit over 10,000 who fit our very strict criteria is absolutely amazing, and I'm over the moon. So thank you all for joining. I'm going to be sorting out a bit of a prize draw to go with that, with some goodies that we had earmarked for the TES SEN show, but I'm sure I can snaffle a few of them, and we'll do a bit of a prize draw for that. Look out for the form in the Facebook group over the next couple of days if you want to enter. Okay. So do stay tuned to the end of tonight's session, because there are a couple of other special announcements that we would like to give, or that Gavin would like to give. I have no idea what's going on. I am delighted to welcome back Angharad Welch tonight for tonight's session. She was a great hit with you all last time and told us lots and lots about speech, language and communication. But apparently there's even more for us to know about. So she's back again today to talk about SLCN assessment. Over to you, Angharad.
Okay, yes, like Abigail said, believe it or not, there is more to know about SLCN. So last time I was talking a little bit about Key Stage 2 and secondary. This time I thought I'd talk a little bit about something that takes up quite a lot of my time when I'm working in schools, which is screening for SLCN at early years and Key Stage 1 at primary. And I get a lot of questions about this, and I see a lot of questions about it in the Facebook group, so I thought it would be a good topic to talk about. So I'm just going to tell you what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to briefly talk about the difference between screening and assessment, because I do find people use that terminology a little bit interchangeably sometimes. And from a speech therapist perspective, they have quite distinctive purposes, those two terms. We'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of screening. It's probably not going to surprise you that I'm pro screening for SLCN, but that does come with some provisos. And just some different ways that you might approach using screening in your setting. So screening everyone in your setting or in a whole year group versus screening as a more targeted thing. I'm very briefly going to talk about what different screening tools are out there. And I've made a table for you with all the kind of main commercially available tools that I'm hoping will go underneath the YouTube video when it gets put up. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the practical experience of implementing the Wellcomm, which is what I've been using with my schools, so you can learn from our mistakes. Okay. And then at the end, I do try to be super practical about this and honest. So I won't try and tell you things that aren't true about screening, and at the end there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions. Okay, so just some terminology really, so you know what we're talking about. So screening or assessment, what are we talking about? So the purpose of screening for SLCN, speech, language and communication needs, is more about identifying risk or need in a group of children. And if you've got a good tool, it'll help you identify next steps for them as well. And it's very much aimed at identifying need in a whole cohort. That might be a group of children you've already chosen to look at. It might be a whole year group, a whole key stage, depending on how you want to use it. Whereas assessment is more what I would consider a specialist would do, a speech and language therapist. So it tends to be more detailed and individualised generally, and it will be a more flexible tool. So the nature of screens are that they're a bit generic, and that has pros and cons to it. Whereas with an assessment, because you've got a specialist coming in, you should see them using a range of assessment tools to get you a complete detailed picture of an individual child. And that may include using standardized tools that are going to give you numbers if you're applying for funding and that kind of thing. Okay, so screening pros and cons. So like I've said, screening is intended to identify need at both the individual level, so tell you which children might have SLCN right now and who's at risk for continuing to have SLCN, but also the whole cohort. So the good thing about screening is it really does let you dig in and plan for a whole group, a whole class, or a whole year group. And unlike your specialist assessments, where you might be reliant, either you might buy a speech therapist in perhaps, or you might be reliant on your local team and whatever they can offer, screening is great because it can be carried out by non-specialists. So you're not going to get that level of detail, but generally speaking, when you've got a speech therapist, particularly if it's an NHS therapist, they're often going to be coming in and looking at individuals, and they can't always give you this whole class or whole year group picture. Screening is absolutely great for doing that. I apologise for this wordy slide. The best screens that are out there are going to be the ones that help you identify, but will also guide you to linked interventions. So, you know, they really justify the time and the cost of doing the screen. And they're much more robust and consistent and more piecemeal systems. So what I mean by that is you'll often see screens that have been put together by local teams, for example, or screens that people have put together themselves. And there's nothing wrong with any of those. But I think the reason you pay your money for some of the more robust systems is that they will take you through the whole process, the screen and the intervention and the data tracking as well. And from my perspective, what I've found with screening and using specific tools that were designed for that purpose is that you're not reliant on the experience and knowledge of individual staff to make decisions about whether children are having difficulties and how worried to be about it. So this actually just happened just today in my school, that a teacher said to our assault assistant who was doing some screening, oh, I don't think you need to take that child, I've got no concerns about them. And then when she screened them, they were actually coming out 2 sections below where they should have been for their age. So that's a really good example. And I think if you are working in an area that has a lot of SLCN, that can become normalised really quickly. And so it can become a bit more unreliable to rely on staff impressions of how good or poor a child's speech and language skills are. Some screens, and I'll talk about which ones, some screens will also support you to track progress, again at the individual and cohort levels, and give you really nice data. And now I'm not a real data person, speech and language therapists tend to be a bit more individualised, but I have to say in terms of making arguments for your investment of time or resource, they are absolutely fantastic because there's nothing quite like numbers to help you make an argument. And some of them have come with really nice software that will do all the working out for you. Okay, cons. Screening is definitely time consuming. And at the end of the screening, you end up with a big old list of interventions you now need to do something about. So I would definitely think of screening, if you're buying a big screening tool into your setting, think of it as a bit of a multi-year project to get it right. So that might seem daunting, but my experience is the schools I'm in most regularly, we are going into our 3rd year, and this is year I think, yeah, you know what, we've cracked this now, I've got it right, because it's taken quite a lot of tweaking to get the screening process right and get the intervention set up. So be prepared to commit to a process really with screening, but it is completely worth it. Screening isn't perfect because it's not as thorough as assessment. So it's not going to pick up everyone. So you will definitely sometimes get the odd child who will pop back up as a concern later. So what a lot of the screens do is focus on the kind of vocabulary and concepts and grammatical structures that you'd expect a child to have developed at that age. So sometimes if a child happens to have quite a spiky profile in terms of their speech and language, sometimes they will get through a screen, but they actually do still have some more subtle language issues. And I would always encourage anybody who's doing screening with a child to not ignore their gut instinct. So just because a screen says a child is passed and is age appropriate, if your impression is still that the child's struggling with some aspects, then you know that's a completely legitimate reason to carry on and get them assessed anyway. Because a lot of your children with language disorder, for example, are pretty able cognitively in terms of adapting, but they might have a whole range of coping strategies that can get them through this screening level. So I'm not going to say it happens all the time, because maybe like one a year pops back up later and I think, oh, that's interesting, they got through the screen okay, but it does happen. So you know, we can't expect it to be the perfect tool. The other thing I find about screening is they're never going to adapt all that well to EAL, because all the tools I'm talking about are based on English norms, English grammar, and that the outcomes are going to depend a little bit on how familiar your EAL children are with English, for example. So you do have to take a little bit of a holistic view of your EAL children, decide whether you're going to screen them necessarily if they're quite new to English, and if you're not going to screen them straight away, make sure you've planned in for going back and screening them at some later point. And then the last thing is that most of the screens do tend to be language focused rather than speech. There is one that is a speech screen, and I'll mention that when we get to that point. So it's not going to pick up. There is a space on the screener for the Wellcomm to note speech concerns, but it doesn't actually do the speech screening for you. So you're still going to have some kind of pathway for picking up on those speech concerns. Though I will say that staff tend to be pretty good at picking up on speech concerns lower down the school because they're fairly obvious. So, but just to be aware, really, if you're planning, then you still need to have some kind of process for your speech sound concerns. Okay, hope everybody's with me so far. So some different ways of using screening. I've kind of mentioned these in passing already. So whole cohort screening, and I'll talk you through how we do this in the schools I'm working in, is my preferred approach to using screening because it's more robust, really. So to either screen a whole class or a whole year group. So in the schools that I work in, we have a screening program that runs all the way through early years and up to the end of Key Stage 1. And then the other approach you can take, which I don't think is quite as robust, but it's still more evidence-based, it's going to be more systematic than, you know, just going off staff impressions, is using screening in a more targeted way. So what I mean by that is where you use the screening as a tool where the staff have identified the children they're concerned about, and then you screen those children. Okay, so the downside of whole cohort screening is definitely the time. And it does need someone to run it. Basically, it needs someone to make sure it gets done and then do whatever follow-up is necessary. So I'm talking here from a point of view of a speech therapist who is often brought in by schools, and I basically run the screening bit for them. And so I'm aware that I probably have an unusual amount of time to run and make sure the screening is working really well. I can imagine that if somebody didn't have salt to run that process for them and it just came down to perhaps a SENCO one person, then that would become much more difficult to manage. So you definitely need to factor in the time. And also I think it's really important not to make false economies when it comes to stuff like paying for sometimes the additional software that will help you capture the data, because I have schools that don't have that software, and it takes me personally a whole lot of time to collate the data. And so that can be a bit of a false economy when you're making decisions about what you're going to invest in for the year. So I'll talk a bit more about that when I get onto the Wellcomm a little bit more specifically. The last problem with whole cohort screening is you're probably going to be shocked about how high your SLCN need is at the end, and then you're sort of obliged to do something about it. So you do open a bit of an SLCN can of worms. Once you've identified the need, you're going to have a process for dealing with all these children. Now, in the schools I've been working in, the last couple of years of screening, in terms of reception, we've been averaging somewhere around 3/4 of children coming in with some level of SLCN. And I don't know if that is consistent with the need more generally, or if that's particularly high because of COVID. So we are just doing our screening in my schools now, so it'd be really interesting now that the children have had slightly more typical early childhood experience in the last year. We'll soon see if the proportions are still high, but 75% of children needing something is a whole lot of planning and follow through. So when you get a high level of need at the end of your screening process, you may well need a multi-strand approach to dealing with it. So your traditional group interventions might not be quite enough to meet all those different levels of need. When I get to talking about how we particularly implement the Wellcomm, I'll explain how we've done that in the schools I'm in. And then using screening in a more targeted way, like I say, is where staff are going to identify the concern for you. So you can definitely miss children this way. But then you're using screening to make decisions about what you do next for those children. I do think it can be a really good place to start, particularly if you're a smaller school with perhaps less resource, less flexibility of resourcing. So I think it takes some of the really good screening packages, take some of the decision making out for you, and I think that can count for a lot, even if you don't aspire to that whole cohort screening. I do still think it's worth doing. So I'm just going to talk briefly. I think I've lost a slide here. Maybe I put it somewhere else. Before I get into talking about individual tools, the other way you can get screening done is by a lot of independent therapists, maybe your local NHS team, I don't know. A lot of independent therapists will come in and run screening for you as well. And I do that in some of our local schools, particularly the smaller schools, who perhaps don't have the time to run a whole programme. Perhaps they can't justify the funds, and they want somebody to do all the screening for them and make the decisions at the end about what needs to happen. And that basically is just sort of outsourcing the time, really, because in the schools I work in, where we have whole cohort programs, I'm not the person doing the screening. Usually a TA will be doing that. So sometimes the smaller schools, it's worth for them just buying a therapist in who will run their own individualised screening and help the staff set up whatever's going to suit their school. So that is an option, and sometimes if you need quite small amounts of screening, that can work well for people too. So I'm just going to run through the main screening tools. I did this search over the summer. I'm not going to pretend that I might not have missed something along the way, but these are all the ones I could find. I'm not going to talk in tons of detail because I have actually made you a PDF with all the stuff I'm going to talk about on the next few slides. And what's covered in that PDF is the name of the tool, the where you can get it from, the costs, and whether that's a one-off cost or not, whether it's a screen or a screen plus intervention tools, and whether you need training to deliver. So all that information is on that PDF, so I hope you'll find that useful. So this is one of the big ones you might be familiar with, is ICANN. So I did actually double check with ICANN because I know some of you might use the Talk Boost interventions, and I did check with them that ICANN don't consider the screen, that baselining tool that's within the Talk Boost, they don't consider it a screen because it's not intended for use across a whole cohort. So it's intended to be used in that targeted way that I was talking about earlier. So if you want to use a kind of true screen, ICANN have what they call the progression tools. And what's nice about those is that they do come in lots of different age ranges. So there's a progression tools early years, which is 3 to 4. There's a primary 4 to 10 years, and there is actually secondary progression tools as well. So the progression tools is what you're after. The good news about that is that you can buy those progression tools relatively cheaply compared to the whole Talk Boost package. But I have put the Talk Boost stuff on your PDF as well, just for your information, really. The Wellcomm is the tool I'm personally most familiar with. So the Wellcomm has a couple of different packages. You've got the early years package, which actually covers most of our children into year 1 as well, and the primary package. And the Wellcomm is both a screen and an intervention tool, and it comes with an optional tracker as well, like a data tracker, which I'm going to talk more about the Wellcomm in a little bit. And then one of the other big tools that's out there that I know some of you guys use is Language Link, which is a very robust set of tools as far as I can tell. So I have not got personal experience with this one. So it screens. It also gives you group intervention and individual intervention packages, tracks all that data, and comes with a staff training package. So you can imagine that is reflected in the cost, but that does seem to be a very complete tool if it's the right thing for your school. I know that the Language Link will give you a free trial if you're interested in that at all. And this is the only package out there, a kind of published package, that also has a speech link. So that will do your speech screening for you. But it's a separate package. So the speech and the language pieces are separate. So I can't speak much more for that tool. It does seem to be one of those things that people either completely love or don't get on with the tool. Okay, and in terms of kind of, oh, excuse me, in terms of much sort of cheaper and less formal packages, this is probably the kind of lowest level of screening tool you can get. So this is called the Teddy Talk Test. I think it's about 75 quid. And it's essentially based around information carrying words or the Derbyshire language scheme, if you're familiar with any of those. And it basically comes with objects and a list of questions for you to carry out. It does give you much less direction, so it doesn't tell you what to do at the end of the process. You still have to make your own decision based on the information. And so in that sense, my feeling is I have used this in a school that already had it. My feeling is that if you didn't have that background knowledge, then there'd be potential for children to slip through the net a bit there. But having said that, I think if you're on a budget and you're looking for something to get you started with screening, I do think it's a nice tool for that budget. If you are familiar with information carrying words, for example, if you've done like a early years outclan or something like that, then it is completely possible to do all the same things as this Teddy Talk Test, like put that information all together yourself. But again, it's all a confidence and time thing. So what Teddy Talk Test has done is kind of gathered all the stuff that would probably, as a speech therapist, this would probably be my kind of screener the first time I met a child. These are the kinds of tools I would use. So it is quite a nice starting point. And it does have objects, which is quite nice for your younger children. This is only really suitable for early years, though, not year one. Here's my slide that got missing. So like I was saying, some schools will buy in therapists to screen in whatever way is going to suit their specific school. Where I live, there are quite a lot of really small schools still, and so sometimes for them, buying something in that's very specific for them is the right option. Okay, so getting into more specifics and just practical experience. So I've been using the Wellcomm now, we're going into our 3rd year, and I cannot claim any positive reasoning on my own part for having chosen the Wellcomm over anything else, because essentially I got a school contract partway through the autumn term and they had just bought the Wellcomm. So it was kind of thrust upon me, but I'm glad it was, because I do really rate it as a screening tool. So how we have dealt with it thus far is that in year one, we just focused on reception. So when I joined that particular school, we had the early years Wellcomm. And actually, we liked it so much at the end of year one that we bought the Wellcomm primary as well. So we did reception in year one, and then in year two, we extended up into Key Stage 1 and extended down into nursery. So I'm going to talk you through what's gone well about that and what hasn't gone so well, and some stuff that we've learned along the way. So on a practical level, the first time you do the screening, it's the nature of screening. We were aspiring to do a whole cohort screening. So that does mean the very first time you screen in any given year group, you have to screen everybody. It takes an extraordinarily long time and might have you questioning the sensibleness of having engaged on the project in the first place, to be honest, but it is well worth doing, I promise. So yeah, again, the time, you might see that I've mentioned time quite a few times through this. So what we do now in our schools is we screen everybody in reception. So everybody gets screened in reception. And then after that, we screen everyone who didn't get an age appropriate score in previous screens, plus new pupils. So over time, this is becoming a lot more manageable. So the first year you do it, you're going to feel like you're screening for the whole of the autumn term. But as you get on and you get systems in place, you're going to find those numbers start to get a lot more manageable. And in fact, one of the schools I work in, we got our year one and year two screening done really quickly this year, because we just got a nice system going and we got to grips with the software, and it chucked us out a list of who we needed to see, and it was all much easier. But it does take a little bit of time to wrap your head around. And the reception screening is pretty easy to organise too. What I found is that keeping the people doing the screening on task and getting them to carry it out accurately can be a bit of a challenge, depending on whether they've got dedicated time or not. So in schools where there's a dedicated person to carry out speech and language therapy interventions, that has worked really well, and where we've got plenty of time to do like shared planning around that. In schools where I'm often using kind of a network of TAs around the SLCN provision, that's a bit more complicated to pull off. And what I have found is if you do get the Wellcomm, even though it's additional cost, I really recommend using the Wellcomm Wizard, which is like the online tool, because essentially you still carry out the screen with all the physical objects, but you do the answers, fill out the answers on the screen. And the good thing about that is when you put the child's date of birth in, it automatically starts you at the right point on the screen, and it kind of won't let you stop until you've done the whole process properly. Because what I do find, so with the Wellcomm, what you do is you start at the age appropriate level and you keep going down through their sections until the child passes something. And the temptation for teachers and staff who can see that a child's not going to pass at the age appropriate level to just skip a few and start where they think is really, really high. But when you use the Wellcomm Wizard, you can't really do that. There's no way to skip sections out. So even though there is a bit of an additional cost to that, I would really recommend using the Wizard. So I think if you've got somebody who is really on board with the process and really sees the benefit, and particularly I'm lucky enough to have a adult TA in one of the schools I work in, and because speech and language is her whole thing, she really kind of gets the process and is very thorough, and so I think this very much depends on personalities really. And the other thing we found in one of my schools particularly, the nursery screening can be a little bit more tricky. So like I say, we do everyone in reception, and we are still trying to get the nursery end of things right. So technically the Wellcomm screening tool goes down to 6 months, which is great. The tool does get a little bit harder to use the lower down you get, because that your younger children inherently are not going to want to do adult-led things, as the screen is kind of set up for. So it becomes a little bit more tricky to do that. So what we have decided, so the schools I'm working in take children from 2. We've decided for now to just focus on the preschool year in terms of this kind of formal screening, because we haven't quite found the right way to make it work lower down the school. And my feeling is, if anybody's ever heard me talk about early years, that really child-led interventions are the way forward with early years for SLCN. And so I feel slightly uncomfortable with doing like an adult-led task to assess children's speech and language at nursery, because it does slightly go against the grain in terms of my own philosophy. And my feeling also is that further down the school, in your in nursery, if you are identifying SLCN, really your go-to thing needs to be really good quality child-led play and interaction. And so I don't think there's quite the same need for you to have all these differentiated little targets and like intervention plans and different activities quite the same way, because actually good quality interaction is going to cover a multitude of your needs for SLCN at nursery. Okay, so screening, the other thing I didn't put on the slide, but it is important, if you're using the Wellcomm Wizard, don't do what we did, which is we screened our reception children, and when it said what group are they in, we put reception. And then the next year we realised that when we were re-screening those children, of course, they were no longer reception. So please avoid the massive amount of work that one of my teaching colleagues had to do, because she had to go through and basically rename all the children by the year group we're in. So now we have them classified, by 15, 16, 16, 17, 17, 18, according to their dates of birth across the cohort. And so if you're re-screening next year, that is significantly easier to manipulate in terms of the data than if you've named them by class. So please, don't do that, because we spent hours fixing it all. The screening itself is really straightforward. So basically the tools in the Wellcomm, you get a series of questions, and some of them are just verbal questions that you ask. It also comes with a picture book, and most of the questions you just ask straight out of the picture book. And then there's a tick cross methods. Basically, you might ask 2 questions, for example, where you might be looking for a child to use a superlative grammatical ending, and basically if they get 1 tick, they don't pass that section. If they get 2, they do. And at the bottom you add up all the ticks, and it tells you, do they come out green, which is passing that section, amber, which is a little bit behind, or red, which is more severely behind in that section. So the screening itself is really straightforward, and usually once somebody's done one, they are really happy. It doesn't take a lot of training, but it's the organising and keeping on track of the screening that's the issue. So like I've already mentioned, children, so on the Wellcomm, the whole Wellcomm, the assessment, the screening bit and the interventions are all split up into sections, which are broadly speaking age norms. So some of them are 6-month bands and some of them a year. So it's the only problem with that is because in early years there's so much speech and language development going on. That's why some of the sections are only 6 months worth of typical development, and some are a year. And then when you get into the primary age, the groupings tend to be a bit more regular, and that can be a bit difficult because at a glance you can't say, oh, all these children are perhaps a year behind where they should be, or because it doesn't quite work quite that easily. But essentially, a child, whatever age they are, will tell you where you need to start in the screen. And then at the end of your little screening section, it'll tell you how many ticks did you need. And if you're using the Wellcomm, it will literally just work this out for you. How many ticks did you need to pass? If they didn't pass, you keep moving down in the developmental stages until they reach the section they can pass. And then when it comes to choosing interventions, you just start the next one up. So for example, you know, a child in reception might start at section 8. This is all explained in the manual. It's section 8, and then maybe they don't pass section 8, they have to go down section 7, they might not pass that, and then they pass section 6. So if they pass section 6, then your intervention would start in section 7. The way it works in my schools, because they've got me, is in terms of the sections, we have a cut-off point where children automatically come straight to me for a more detailed assessment. So if they are more than a certain number of sections behind, we don't go in with the Wellcomm as an intervention. We go straight to an assessment, and or we refer them to NHS services. I won't pretend there's much science to where that point is. That's just a slightly arbitrary cut-off point that we decided that the more generic interventions weren't going to be quite suitable. Okay, I'm going to show you in a second what the intervention looks like. The intervention doesn't come with materials. Okay. So I'm just going to show the early years intervention, but the primary one's very similar. So it comes with this big book of ideas. And the idea is that when you finish, so there's lots of nice guidance at the beginning that explains everything. This is what I was talking about the sections. So you look at the child's age, and then it'll tell you what section to start at. So say for the sake of argument that a child needs interventions in section 1. So what you will find is in each section, in each little age band, it'll split down targets, roughly 10 for each section, into nice little mini targets around their speech and language. And it'll say why that thing's important, give you either a strategy for the younger children or a more specific activity. And they tend to be activities you can do with just stuff you will have in early years or Key Stage 1 anyway. So they tell you how to do the activity, how to make it harder, and how to make it easier. So it is actually a really nice resource. And some of you might already have this big book of ideas. There was a time, I don't think you can buy it separately now, but there was a time you could just buy it by itself as a resource. So these are really nice for identifying IEP targets and stuff for individuals as well. So that's the way it's set up. My gut instinct was that if I left people to just come up with their own activities on the fly based on those sheets, that was going to get in the way of us being able to do interventions consistently. I know what time's like. So what we've done, particularly in early years and Key Stage 1, is we've made up packs of materials for each of those targets. You don't need to do that, but it just means basically there's like a grab file for every section. And those materials are just a bit of a cobbled together mix of Black Sheep Press and Twinkle, to be honest with you. There's nothing particularly special about them, but it just means that whoever's running the intervention that day can just grab it, and we put all the recording sheets so they can record that they've done it and what the outcomes were. We put that all together. It was super time consuming the first time, but it basically means that it pretty much runs itself. So it is worth doing that, but you don't have to. So like I said, the screen tells you which section to work on, and then the book gives you these sub targets. It's a really nice book for sharing with parents as well. It's a very well thought through intervention and resource, I think. Okay, so earlier on I was talking about needing multiple ways to deliver, especially if you end up identifying loads and loads of needs. So we personally have done this in several ways. This is kind of what I like about the Wellcomm. I'm not as familiar with those other packages that I mentioned, but most of them are designed to kind of work with a specific intervention delivered in a specific way. What I like about the Wellcomm is you can use it as an individual intervention. So you could give those sheets to a TA to use as an individual. You can do it in a small group, which is mostly how we do it. We also do classroom level modelling. So last year we ended up with a lot of children, say a class might end up with a group of children in section 7 intervention, a group in section 8, a group in section 9. It's quite a lot to manage. So what we tended to do was, particularly the children who maybe they were just one section down, perhaps just 6 months behind in terms of the plan, what we might do rather than taking them out for intervention is that I would work with the teachers to try and model those concepts. So for example, some of them are things like days of the week or yesterday and tomorrow, things like that. So some of them lend themselves really nicely to just practicing in real life environments. So we would sit together, do some planning, and then work out which of these targets are going to be easy for us to model at a whole classroom level. And you can also share the sheets with families. So if families are looking to have something to do, so that, and they're really nicely laid out and explained for families as well. So I do particularly like that about the Wellcomm, is the flexibility. But then it does also need, if you're going to be flexible, it needs somebody to work all those things out. And again, I really realise that I'm blessed to be brought in to do that and have headspace to think about it. Okay, and then the Wellcomm primary is obviously primary interventions. The interventions work slightly differently. The screening works the same, because in Key Stage 1 we happen to have the early years as well. So what we do is, if children don't pass the first stage of the primary, we go back and screen them down on the early years one. But you needn't. That's not particularly how it's designed to work. So if you just have the Wellcomm primary and they don't pass that first section, then you would just start working on that first section. I don't find the big book of ideas for the Wellcomm primary as opposed to the early years. The early years one is really thick because there's so much happening in children's language development in the early years. The big book of ideas for primary is relatively slim, because actually the interventions tend to boil down into a few main themes. And what you will find is the activities aren't quite so clearly delineated, which does give you more flexibility, but is a bit more reliant then on staff to tweak it to the right age. So the interventions basically boil down into narrative interventions, grammar and vocabulary for the most part. And they tend to be a little bit more strategy focused. So things like doing vocab maps, for example, rather than teaching specific concepts, which is what the early years one looks like. So the nature of the primary one is it's a bit more flexible, but I personally have maybe not found it quite so easy to implement. Okay, so biggest problems with Wellcomm are the same problems you get with all the things I've already talked about, is the setup and monitoring time. It just does take time. If you can really dedicate time to tweaking it and working it out, like I said, one of my schools in particular, we have really focused in on the detail of it. And this is the first year I'm really thinking, yeah, it's going quickly. We're getting to the point of setting up the interventions a lot quicker, but it has taken quite a lot of trial and error. And like anything you do really in schools, keeping the interventions going is a massive challenge, because you do end up with quite a lot of interventions on the go. And so you need to, anything you do really in terms of your SLCN systems tends to have a knock-on effect somewhere else. And so you do need to kind of go into it with the idea that you're going to need probably to follow these issues down the chain. They are not unsolvable. I mean, what I love about it is that because I've got that data from the Wellcomm, and then we are really working hard on capturing at the moment the intervention data and making sure that's consistent. I've got really great argument for why we might need more resource and things like that. So it's time consuming, and sometimes it can be really disheartening when you've done all this screening and then you go a term down the line and you realise nobody's run the interventions for the last 6 weeks. I'm sure you have those problems in your schools too. So, but because you've got this nice process and data in place, you can really track through where the problems are happening. So, once you've solved your identification problem, it does tend to create an issue somewhere else, but you know, you really know where their problems are and you can fix what actually needs fixing. Because what I find is a lot of people start with the intervention level when it comes to SLCN, and then when that doesn't feel like it's working, they think, oh, it's the intervention that's the problem, I'll choose a different package. But actually the issue was never probably that, it was probably getting the identification right and then really getting into the fine detail, the implementation. It's so tempting to just buy a nice new package, isn't it? But actually the reality is in most of the generic speech and language packages that they tend to be pretty similar. So if I was going to spend money on a resource, I probably would spend time and money on the screening component, because it really helps you get your whole system set up in school, and getting out of that reactive place with interventions and helping you plan, even if you can't solve all the issues right now. So you do get a discomfort issue when you've identified a load of children, and sometimes you realize you can't deal with all that need right now, and you know that is a big old moral quandary, but you just have to accept that every tweak that you make is getting you closer to a really robust system for your children. Definitely needs to be somebody's responsibility. It doesn't have to be a speech therapist, but it will not run and monitor itself. So if you've got a speech therapist in school already, different speech therapists like to work to different models. You might have a speech therapist who is very focused on the intervention piece, which is completely fair enough. I like systems and big picture stuff. So you're going to need to speak to your speech therapist really about where they see this stuff fitting in with their work, if you're lucky enough to have access to one. So in total, screening is well worth doing, and it develops skills in your staff. So the one thing that staff do tell me consistently is when they run the screening, it really helps them to get to know the children, and also to give them realistic ideas about what language skills the children should be using at each age and stage. And the data is super useful. So for example, in one of my schools, we had a really nice set of data that compared outcomes in nursery versus reception, and that really helped us understand that reception needed more resources to support their child-led interactions, because that stuff gets squeezed out in reception a little bit more than in nursery. So the outcomes and how many children had moved in terms of their screening really helped us understand what we needed in each of those year groups. Personally, I am certainly not a salesperson for Wellcomm. It's just the one I know best. I'm not convinced that any one tool is better than another, if I'm really honest. So if you already have something that you're using, I wouldn't rush out necessarily and get something else in terms of a screening package. I think the devil is in the implementation, to be honest with you. So most speech and language things, I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but most speech and language things you buy are probably pretty similar to each other. It's about what's going to work for you as a school and about having that follow through in terms of implementation. Okay, so what are your questions about the screening process? And I will try and help, or maybe I've just stunned you into submission.
Nobody's asked any questions yet, but
nobody's
fingers crossed. Let's let them wake up for a second.
Yeah, I'm aware I've thrown a load of detail at you. Right, I'm trying to work it out.
I posted a link to Black Sheep Press whilst you were talking. Just I know that not everybody's heard of them, so we've popped that one in. And I was on the ICANN site last week, and they've got some really great free training on there as well, which I've just signposted all of my teaching assistants towards. So definitely worth having a look at.
Really nice stuff. They also have some really nice like pre-done CPD slides about developmental language disorder and stuff. They've got, well worth following them on social media. They've got stuff coming out all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so Tracy said, if you don't have the wizard, do you use the paper screener, or do you have an Excel sheet set up?
I use the paper screener. Yeah, we use the paper forms, and then I laboriously have to transfer the data into a format that we use in school. There is like a summary sheet, which is what we use for at a glance sort of data that staff use as they go. But when it comes to actually collating information to pass on to SLT and stuff like that, that's just down to me counting numbers.
You mean data, that thing you don't like?
Yes, I don't particularly like it, but I do understand it's what needs to happen to communicate with people. So I have to say the Wellcomm wizard is not my favourite thing in the world, but today I just pressed some buttons, a load of reports came out, and it's probably saved me about 3 days worth of counting. So well worth it.
Louise said, if you're working with a targeted group of children, how easy is it to record the results, or does it need to be completed one-to-one?
Oh, it definitely needs to be completed one-to-one. Yeah. And then you just choose how big that group is. But yeah, you have to do the screening one-to-one.
Yeah, screening one-to-one, definitely.
The thing I probably didn't say was it's a bit hard to say how long the screening takes per child. But when we're planning, because obviously some children might be sat there for a long time until they pass, but when we're planning, we factor in about 20 minutes per child, which seems to be a good average, because there are children who'll get through it in 5 minutes and there are children who'll take much longer.
Within your schools, are you needing to use these as a stopgap for NHS assault shortage? And if so, what would you suggest as the next steps when you can't get a speech and language therapist without the specialist guidance? Oh, I say you're high Angharad, but she's up to the eyeballs at the moment.
So, I mean, I think the thing about screening is it probably captures those children who maybe never were going to quite reach the criteria for the local team, but actually do have a need. So there's that. So what we do, so I try really hard in the schools I work in to never replace what the NHS is doing. So I see it very much as essentially it's setting up the SENCO with information to know who needs referring right now, who can we run an intervention for in school, and then make a decision about. And then my time in terms of assessment and an intervention, I sometimes will fill a gap until the NHS therapist turns up.
What would you suggest as the next steps when you can't get a speech and language therapist without the specialist guidance?
Okay, well, I do think this is, if you do not have funding for a speech and language therapist at all, and you don't have much access to NHS, this is what screening is really great for. It's never going to do that really super specialist stuff, you know, that you do need a therapist for some things, but the reason these tools have come about is exactly that need. So I do think it's a really robust way of filling that gap, and for finding those children who, like I say, maybe they were never quite going to reach the criteria for your local team, but they still needed something. So I hope that answers that question.
I think so. So locally they have a massive waiting list even for serious issues, which is why she was asking the question.
Yes. Well, many independent speech therapists exist, and we'll be glad to sell you services for your school. That's basically why this local independent market has sprung up, really. And don't be put off by the cost, because they get a lot of people do all sorts of different packages and can, would discuss what your funds are, what your needs are. I think personally a really good school speech therapist will sit down and help you really work out what you need, not just kind of go in, oh, I like doing interventions, I'll do that bit. They'll really help you understand where your needs are and how to capture that need.
I work with a lot of multi-academy trusts, and they're kind of going down the route now of having their own speech and language therapist, whether it's 1 day a week or 3 days a week or something, and then sharing it across their schools as required. Same thing with education psychologists, which is why we don't have them in the local authority in the NHS, because we're kind of poaching them and putting them into the multi-academy trusts. But it is now allowing them to meet the needs of their students and their schools and their cohorts.
It does, I have to say, it works really well, because as an NHS therapist, I was very much there for the individual child, and I wasn't really, my remit was not to help SENCOs at that whole school level.
Yeah.
And so you might get a speech therapist in school for your most complex children, but they came in, they set the program, they left again. And what's great about having an independent therapist, doesn't necessarily need to be me, is that you can really understand what you need as a school, and you can buy them in to do just that. There's no discussion about, well, the trust makes me do this or doesn't let me do that. And that's one of the things I like about being independent, is that I can really meet the need the school actually has, not the one that they've allowed to have.
Yeah, exactly. And because you're working with the staff in that school, it upskills those staff as well, which you may make yourself redundant at some point doing this, but you're upskilling them to be able to meet those needs and identify those needs much quicker.
The thing is, even if there were many more speech therapists, it's never going to be enough to be in every place at the same time. And so there is something to be said for, like, just today, year 6 TA came and said, don't know what to do about this child, and we ended up having an impromptu 20 minutes on visual support. Like, that could never happen if you didn't just have somebody around in school. And so there is a lot of stuff that you end up teaching people just in the ether, just in those little discussions you have. And my personal take on it is that if everybody in schools is really knowledgeable about SLCN and interventions for SLCN, then I just have to up my game and get more specialists, and that can only be a good thing for speech therapy. So
Tracy said, do you have sorry, do you have any data for the SLCN increase in early years? She said you mentioned 75% of children. Is that just through the schools you've worked in, or is it a national figure that's come from somewhere?
Off, yeah, those are the schools that I work in, I was talking about. There is some data, and now can I remember where it was published? I think it was the Education Endowment Fund. They did a report. I think it was the Education Endowment Fund. They did a report on SLCN like a year after the end of the first lockdown. I'm really sorry, I don't know where that link is offhand. Do you remember it, Abigail?
I do. So there's a magazine, is it Speech Link, the magazine?
Yes.
I've got a feeling there's an article in there with some data in it as well.
Yes. And also ICANN did a report on the impact of COVID.
Yeah.
So all those three. So yeah, ICANN, Speech Link, and the Education Endowment Fund have all done some data collection around that. Yeah, I was going off my schools. So far we're hovering around 75% delayed. Yeah.
No access to services during that period of lockdown. Certainly not for the ones that didn't go to nursery. So our youngest son's currently year 1. He was a stay-at-home child, so until he started in reception last year, had never set foot out of the house into a nursery or anything else, because lockdown came along and it was like, well, there's no point putting him in now, we'll just keep him at home. So you've got a lot of children that are like that, and especially for parents where it's their first child, perhaps they don't necessarily realise that they are different or behind or struggling with, and parents who were working from home during that time didn't have the time to engage in conversation with their children. So a knock-on impact of a whole variety of things, I think.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I'm already, the teachers this year are saying they're noticing that children's speech language is better in my schools anyway. And the year 1 and 2 teachers are saying, you can tell these children have been in a whole year of school finally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that trend stays high or if it comes back down again. I mean, it was never, the SLCN numbers were always pretty high, weren't they? But
we'll see what happens.
Yes.
Has anybody else got any more questions? Let's give them another minute to see what they've got. Type as quickly as you can. It doesn't tell me on my screen anymore if anybody's typing. It used to give me the dots.
Maybe they've updated the system, or I've updated the system and it's all gone wrong.
They just deleted it from me.
People are very welcome, if they think of questions afterwards, they're very welcome to come over to my I've got a Facebook page. Find the Key Speech and Language Therapy is my business, so you're very welcome to come and drop me a message through Facebook, or find me on Twitter, or any of the places I hang out. Okay. Those are all the places to find me.
If you want to find out how, she's also lurking in our group as well, so you could always find her in there. Okay, so thank you, Angharad. That was a fantastic presentation again. It was really informative. I was sat nodding my head at one point and scowling and having a bit of a rant in the chat, because of course this thing about gathering data and then not doing anything with it is like, which is one of my big bugbears. Gavin, you wanted to...
We have the surprise for Angharad. Okay, we announced it on the Twitter. Angharad hopefully doesn't have too much of a clue what we're about to say.
I don't have a clue what you're about to say.
Abigail definitely doesn't have a clue what we're about to say.
Give me a bit of a hint, but I don't know.
But we know that Angharad has been really, really supportive in our Facebook group, and she's come and done 2 of these things for us. So we're kind of going to do a bit of a promotion for Angharad here. Angharad, you're going to gain a Facebook badge of support expertness within our thing. We also would like to offer you a space on our website for all SLCN news and anything else that you want to post up with your own stuff. And finally, anybody who is within our website who is paying £5 a month for the premium thing, which I think we haven't 6 or 7 of at the moment. We're going to pay for them to get your support package, your newsletter, as well on top of that. So a bit of a thank you from us to you.
It's absolutely amazing to have a place to come and be in front of SENCOs, to be honest with you. I genuinely, because I really love collaborating with SENCOs and problem solving. And I think speech and language therapist SENCOs are very much on the same bandwidth, you know. So I'm just so glad that you guys run all this, and because I know it's an extraordinary amount of work, and to get this many people in one Facebook group, I must tell you, as somebody who has a Facebook group, is an amazing amount of effort. And you know, so kudos on you. So yeah, absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angharad.
Thank you.
Angharad is at the SLCN show on the Friday.
On the Friday, yes.
On the Friday. So if anybody's hopping along and can hop in on the Friday.
I think you're speaking, aren't you?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. Would you like me to tell you a bit about
Go
that?
on then.
Yeah, what's it called?
Basically, so my background as a speech therapist when I was an NHS therapist is actually complex needs. So I'm going to be talking about supporting children with complex medical and developmental needs in mainstream environments.
There you go.
So if you've got any of those, would it be okay just to contextualise what you were saying about the newsletter thing, so that people know what you're talking about? Would that be all right?
Yeah.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, basically. So some of you, I think, have already. I've had some people buy. Basically, I really recognise that trying to get CPD messages out to your staff is extremely challenging, and certainly trying to get them out. You know, you might get one go a year if you're lucky, mightn't you? So what I've put together is as basically a half-termly series of emails, CPD emails for you to share with your staff, that have just got really nice basic messages about SLCN, recognising SLCN, and what you can do about it in the classroom. So that's what you were referencing there with your subscription. So yes, so that's absolutely amazing. I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and I really do love working with SENCOs. I don't just say it. So I'm always up for I'm always up for finding different ways to work with you. And if you guys have got ideas for tools that will help you in school with SLCN, I'm always up for hearing about them, basically.
That's it. Sorry, I'll read my own screen rather than her screen.
Your own screen now. So yes, thank you to everybody, and we have recorded this, and it will be up on YouTube.
It will be up on the YouTube
within a couple of days.
Saturday morning. Hopefully, the links for all of Angharad's resources that she said, the PDF files, will be in the Facebook group and the website